Hari Hari Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari Hari Shri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Shri Advaita Gadada Srivas Adi Gora Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hare Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram 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 Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Rama Rama Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Ram Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Krishna Hari Ram Hari Ram 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 Hari 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 Krishna Ram Ram Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram Okay, devotees, this evening we'll continue reading Prabhupada-lilamrita. It's the best thing under the circumstances. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatyadesh Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gobhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchakapatarubhyas Jakripas Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. We may possibly finish a little early this evening. We'll see. As Prabhupada retired to his apartment and his guests disappeared through the front door back into the city, Don and Raphael would turn out the lights. Lock the front door and go to sleep on the floor in their blankets. Don and Raphael had needed a place to stay when they heard about the Swami's place. Prabhupada had a policy that any boy who expressed even a little interest in becoming a student could stay in the storefront and make it his home. Of course, Prabhupada would ask them to contribute toward the rent and meals. But if, like Don and Raphael, they had no money, then it was still all right, provided they helped in other ways. Don and Raphael were the first two boys to take advantage of Prabhupada's offer. They were attracted to Swamiji and the chanting, but they weren't serious about his philosophy or the disciplines of devotional life. They had no jobs and no money. Their hair was long and unkempt, and they lived and slept in the same clothes day after day. Prabhupada stipulated that at least while they were on the premises, they could not break his rules: no intoxication, illicit sex, meat eating, or gambling. He knew these two boarders weren't serious students, but he allowed them to stay in hopes that gradually they would become serious. Often some wayfaring stranger would stop by, looking for a place to stay the night, and Don and Raphael would welcome him. An old, white-bearded Indian turned Christian who was on a walking mission proclaiming the end of the world and whose feet were covered with bandages, once slept for a few nights on a wooden bench in the storefront. Some nights, as many as 10 drifters would seek shelter at the storefront, and Don and Raphael would admit them, explaining that the Swami didn't object as long as they got up early. Even drifters whose only interest was a free meal could stay, and after the morning class and breakfast, they would usually drift off again into Maya. Don and Raphael were the Swami's steady boarders, although during the day they also went out, returning only for meals, sleep, and evening chanting. Occasionally they would bathe, and then they would use the Swami's bathroom up in his apartment. Shio. Sometimes they would hang out in the storefront during the day, and if someone stopped by asking about the Swami's classes, they would tell the person all they knew, which wasn't much. They admitted that they weren't really into the Swami's philosophy, and they didn't claim to be his followers. If someone persisted in inquiring about the Swami's teachings, Don and Raphael would suggest, "Why don't you go up and talk to him? The Swami lives in the apartment building out back. Why don't you go up and see him?" Prabhupada usually stayed in his apartment. Occasionally he might look out his window and see through the back windows of the storefront that the light in the closet-sized bathroom had needlessly been left burning. Coming down to ask the boys to turn it off and not waste electricity, he might find a few boys lying on the floor talking or reading. Prabhupada would stand gravely, asking them not to leave the light on, stressing the seriousness of wasting Krishna's energy and money. He would stand dressed in khadi, that coarse, hand-loomed cotton woven from hand-spun threads, a cloth that to Americans appears somehow exotic. Even the saffron color of Prabhupada's dhoti and chadar was exotic, produced from the traditional Indian dye. It was a dull, uneven color, different from anything Western. After Prabhupada turned off the light, the boys seemed to have nothing to say and nothing more appropriate to do than look with interest at him for a long, awkward moment, and the Swami would leave without saying anything more. Money was scarce. From his evening meetings, he would usually collect about $5 or $6 in change and bills. Don talked of going up to New England to pick apples and bring back money for the Swami. Raphael said something about some money coming. Prabhupada waited and depended on Krishna. Sometimes he would walk back and forth in the courtyard between the buildings. Seeing mysterious to the neighbors, he would chant on his beads, his hand deep in his bead bag. Mostly he kept to his room working. As he had said during a lecture when living on the Bowery, I'm here always working at something, reading or writing, something, reading or writing, 24 hours. His mission of translating Srimad Bhagavatam, of presenting the complete work in 60 volumes of 400 pages each, could alone occupy all his days and nights. He worked at it whenever possible, sitting at his portable typewriter or translating the Sanskrit into English. He especially worked in the very early hours of the morning when he would not be interrupted. He would comb through the Sanskrit and Bengali commentaries of the great acharyas, following their explanations, selecting passages from them, adding his own knowledge and realization, and then laboriously weaving it all together and typing out his Bhaktivedanta purports. He had no means or immediate plans for financing the publishing of further volumes, but he continued in the faith that somehow they would be published. He had a broad mission, broader even than translating Srimad Bhagavatam, and so he gave much of his time and energy to meeting visitors. Had his only aim been to write, then there would have been no need to have taken the risk and trouble of coming to America. Now many people were coming, and an important part of his mission was to talk to them and convince them of Krishna consciousness. His visitors were usually young men who had recently come to live on the Lower East Side. He had no secretary to screen his visitors, nor did he have scheduled visiting hours. Whenever anyone happened by at any time, from early morning to 10 at night, Prabhupada would stop his typing or translating and speak with them. It was an open neighborhood, and many visitors would come by right off the street. Some were serious, but many were not. Some even came intoxicated. Often they came not to inquire submissively, but to challenge. Once a young hippie on an LSD trip found his way upstairs and sat opposite the Swami. "Right now, I am higher than you are," he announced. "I am God." Prabhupada bowed his head slightly, his palms folded. Please accept my obeisances, he said. Then he asked God to please leave. Others admitted frankly that they were crazy or haunted by ghosts and sought relief from their mental suffering. Lon Solomon. I was looking for spiritual centers, places where one can go, not like stores where they ask you to leave, but where you can actually talk to people and try to understand the ultimate truth. I would come to the Swamis, knowing it was definitely a spiritual center. There was definitely something there. I was on drugs and disturbed with the notion that I must be God or some very important personality way out of proportion to my actual situation. I was actually in trouble, mentally deranged because of so much suffering. And I would kind of blow in to see him whenever I felt the whim to do so. I didn't make a point of going to his meetings, but a lot of times I would just come. One time I came and spent the night there. I was always welcome at any time to sleep in the storefront. I wanted to show the Swami what a sad case I was, so he should definitely do something for me. He told me to join him and he could solve my problems, but I wasn't ready. I was really into sex, and I wanted to know what he meant by illicit sex. What was his definition? He said to me, "This means sex outside of marriage." But I wasn't satisfied with the answer, and I asked him for more details. He told me to first consider the answer he had given me, and then come back the next day, and he would tell me more. That's a good strategy. Then I showed up with a girl. The Swami came to the door and said, "I'm very busy. I have my work. I have my translating. I cannot talk with you now." Well, that was the only time he didn't offer me full hospitality and full attention and talk with me as many questions as I had. So I left immediately with the girl. He was correct in his perception that I was simply going to see him just to try to impress the girl. He saw through it right away, and he rejected that type of association. But every time I came, I was in trouble, and he always helped me. Sometimes young men would come with scholarly pretensions to test the Swami's knowledge of Bhagavad Gita. "You have read the Gita," Prabhupada would say, "so what is your conclusion?" If you claim to know the Gita, then you should know the conclusion that Krishna is presenting. But most people didn't think that there was supposed to be a definite conclusion to the Gita. And even if there were such a conclusion, that didn't mean they were supposed to arrange their life around it. The Gita was a spiritual book, and you didn't have to follow it. Those young people, their ideas were just so ridiculous, fantastically ridiculous. One young man approached the Swami asking, "What book will you lecture from next week? Will you be teaching the Tibetan Book of the Dead?" Oh, Krishna. As if Prabhupada would teach spirituality like a college survey course in world religions. "Everything is there in Bhagavad Gita," Prabhupada replied. "We could study one verse for 3 months." And there were other questions. What about Camus? What is his philosophy, Prabhupada would ask. He says everything is absurd, and the only philosophical question is whether to commit suicide. Then Prabhupada replies, "That means everything is absurd for him. The material world is absurd, but there's a spiritual world beyond this one. That means he does not know the soul. The soul cannot be killed." Adherents of various thinkers approached him. What about Nietzsche, Kafka, Timothy Leary, Bob Dylan? Prabhupada would ask what their philosophy was, and the particular follower would have to explain and defend his favorite intellectual hero. "They're all mental speculators," Prabhupada would say. "Here in this material world, we're all conditioned souls. Your knowledge is imperfect, your senses are blunt. What good is your opinion? We have to hear from the perfect authority, Krishna." A boy asked, "Do you mean to say that none of the great thinkers are God-conscious?" Prabhupada replies, "Their sincerity is their God-consciousness. But if they want perfect knowledge of God, then we have to consult Shastra." Often there were challenges, but under the Swami's stare and hard logic, the challenger would usually trail off into thoughtful silence. Here's an example. Is the spiritual knowledge of China advanced? Prabhupada would sometimes answer simply by making a sour face. Someone said, "Well, I'm a follower of Vedanta myself." Prabhupada replied, "Do you know what Vedanta means? What is the first aphorism of the Vedanta Sutra? Do you know?" The boy replied, "No, Then how can you speak of Vedanta? Vedaischa veraham eva vedya. Krishna says that he is the goal of Vedanta. So if you're a Vedantist, then you must become Krishna conscious. But what about the Buddha? Do you follow?" Prabhupada replied, "Do you follow him?" "No." Prabhupada, "No, you just talk. Why don't you follow? Follow Krishna, follow Christ, follow Buddha, but don't just talk." Someone said, "This sounds the same as Christianity. How is it any different?" Prabhupada, "It's the same. Love of God. But who is a Christian? Who follows? The Bible teaches, 'Thou shalt not kill.' But all over the world, Christians are expert in killing. Do you know that? I believe the Christians say that Jesus Christ died for our sins. So why are you still sinning?" Although Prabhupada was a stranger to America, they were strangers to absolute knowledge. Whenever anyone would come to see him, he wouldn't waste time. He talked philosophy, reason, and argument. He constantly argued against atheism and impersonalism. He spoke strongly to prove the existence of God and the universality of Krishna consciousness. He talked often and vigorously, day and night, meeting all kinds of questions and philosophies. He would listen also, and he heard a wide range of local testimonies. He heard the dissatisfaction of young Americans with the war and with American society. The war means the Vietnam War. So crazy, you know, the Vietnam War. You know, they're killing so many innocent people. And then after a while, they just pulled out. And the bad guys took over the whole country. And they're running the whole country. Yeah. The Viet Cong, they are communists. And the Americans were fighting and fighting against them. Then they just pulled out and let them take over. And in Afghanistan, just in the last couple of months, whatever it is, you know, for, I don't know, at least 10 years or something, fighting, and so many just local people were killed, so many thousands of them. Then the Americans just pull out, and the bad guys just take over. It's just, what is this? It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, well, the American government, you know, they're pretty bad in many ways, and that's one of them. Too aggressive, far too aggressive. One boy told him he didn't want to get married because he couldn't find a chaste girl. It was better to go with prostitutes. Another confided that his mother had planned to abort him, but at the last moment, his grandmother had convinced her not to. He heard from homosexuals. Someone told him that a set of New Yorkers considered it chic to eat the flesh of aborted babies. And in every case, he told them the truth. He talked with Marxists and explains that although Marx says that everything is the property of the state, the fact is that everything is the property of God. Only, quote unquote, spiritual communism, which puts God in the center, can actually be successful. 96. He discounted LSD visions as hallucinations and explained how God can be seen factually and what God looks like. Although these one-time visitors came and went away, a few new friends began to stay on, watching the Swami deal with different guests. They began to appreciate the Swami's arguments, his concern for people, and his devotion to Krishna. He seemed actually to know how to help people, and he invariably offered them Krishna consciousness as much as they could take as the solution to their problems. A few began to take the Swami's message to heart. We shall call our society ISKCON, Prabhupada had laughed playfully when he first coined the acronym. He had initiated the legal work of incorporation that spring while still living on the Bowery. But even before its legal beginning, he had been talking about his International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And so it had appeared in letters to India and in the Village Voice. A friend had suggested a title that would sound more familiar to Westerners: International Society for God Consciousness. But Prabhupada had insisted, Krishna consciousness. God was a vague term, whereas Krishna was exact and scientific. God consciousness was spiritually weaker, less personal. And if Westerners didn't know that Krishna was God, then the International Society for Krishna Consciousness would tell them by spreading his glories, quote unquote, in every town and village. Quote unquote, Krishna consciousness was Prabhupada's own rendering of a phrase from Srila Rupa Goswami's Padyavali, written in the 16th century. Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavita, to be absorbed in the mellow taste of executing devotional service to Krishna. But to register ISKCON legally as a non-profit, tax-exempt religion required money and a lawyer. Carl Jurgens had already gained some experience in forming religious, political, and social welfare groups. And when he had met Prabhupada on the Bowery, he had agreed to help. He had contacted his lawyer, Stephen Goldsmith. Stephen Goldsmith Stephen Goldsmith, a young Jewish lawyer with a wife and 2 children and an office on Park Avenue, was interested in spiritual movements. When Carl told him about Prabhupada's plans, he was immediately fascinated by the idea of setting up a religious corporation for an Indian Swami. He visited Prabhupada at 26 Second Avenue, and they discussed incorporation, tax exemption, Prabhupada's immigration status, and Krishna consciousness. Mr. Goldsmith visited Prabhupada several times. Once he brought his children, who liked the quote-unquote soup the Swami cooked. It's probably dal. He began attending the evening lectures, where he was often the only non-hippie member of the congregation. One evening, having completed all the legal groundwork and being ready to complete the procedures for incorporation, Mr. Goldsmith came to Prabhupada's lecture and kirtan to get signatures from the trustees for the new society. Now this is interesting. Let's just see. Oh, it's long. Anyway, we'll read some. July the 11th. Prabhupada is lecturing. Mr. Goldsmith, wearing slacks and a shirt and tie, sits on the floor near the door, listening earnestly to the lecture despite the distracting noises from the neighborhood. Prabhupada has been explaining how scholars mislead innocent people with non-devotional interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita. And now, in recognition of the attorney's respectable presence, and as if to catch Mr. Goldsmith's attention better, he introduces him into the subject of the talk. Quote, "I will give you a practical example of how things are misinterpreted, just like our president, Mr. Goldsmith." Yeah. He knows that expert lawyers, by interpretation, can do so many things. When I was in Calcutta, there was a rent tax passed by the government, and some expert lawyer changed the whole thing by his interpretation. The government had to reenact a whole law because their purpose was foiled by the interpretation of this lawyer. So we're not out for foiling the purpose of Krishna, for which the Bhagavad Gita was spoken, but unauthorized persons are trying to foil the purpose of Krishna. Therefore, that is unauthorized. All right, Mr. Goldsmith, you can ask anything. Mr. Goldsmith stands, and to the surprise of the people gathered, he makes a short announcement asking for signers on an incorporation document for the Swami's new religious movement. Prabhupada, they're present here. You can take the addresses now. Mr. Goldsmith, I can take them now, yes. Prabhupada, yes, you can. Bill, you can give your address. And Raphael, you can give yours. And Don, Roy, Mr. Green. As the meeting breaks up, those called on to sign as trustees come forward, standing around in the little storefront, waiting to leaf cursorily through the pages the lawyer has produced from his thin attaché and to sign as he directs. Yet not a soul among them is committed to Krishna consciousness. Mr. Goldsmith meets his quota of signers, a handful of sympathizers with enough reverence towards the Swami to want to help him. The first trustees, who will hold office for a year until the first annual meeting of the corporation, are Michael Grant, that's Mukunda, who puts down his name and address without even reading the document. Mike's girlfriend Jan and James Green, who I think, Joshua Green, isn't it? Is Yogeshwar. Anyway, okay. James Green. No one seriously intends to undertake any formal duties as trustee of the religious society, but they're happy to help the Swami by signing his fledgling society into legal existence. According to law, a second group of trustees will assume office for the second year. They're Paul Gardner, Roy, and Don. The trustees for the third year are Carl Jurgens, Bill Epstein, and Raphael. None of them know exactly what the half a dozen legal-sized type pages mean, except that, quote unquote, Swamiji is forming a society. Why? For tax exemption, in case someone gives a big donation, and for other benefits an official religious society might receive. But these purposes hardly seem urgent or even relevant to the present situation. Who's going to make donations? Except maybe for Mr. Goldsmith, who has any money? But Prabhupada is planning for the future, and he's planning for much more than just tax exemptions. He's trying to serve as spiritual predecessors and fulfill the scriptural prediction of a spiritual movement that is to flourish for 10,000 years in the midst of the age of Kali. Within the vast Kali age, a period which is to last 432,000 years, the 1960s are but an insignificant moment. The Vedas describe that the time of the universe revolves through a cycle of 4 seasons or yugas, and Kali Yuga is the worst of times, in which all spiritual qualities of men diminish until humanity is finally reduced to a bestial civilization, devoid of human decency. However, the Vedic literature foretells a golden age of spiritual life, beginning after the advent of Lord Chaitanya and lasting for 10,000 years, an eddy that runs against the current of Kali Yuga, with a vision that soars off to the end of the millennium and beyond, yet with his 2 feet solidly on the ground of Second Avenue. Prabhupada has begun an international society for Krishna consciousness. He has many practical responsibilities, paying the rent, incorporating his society, and paving the way for a thriving worldwide congregation of devotees. Yet he doesn't see his humble beginning as limiting the greater scope of his divine mission. He knows that everything depends on Krishna, so whether he succeeds or fails is up to the Supreme. He has only to try. The purposes stated within ISKCON's Articles of Incorporation reveal Prabhupada's thinking. There were 7 points, similar to those given in the prospectus for the League of Devotees he formed in Jhansi, India in 1953. That attempt had been unsuccessful, yet his purposes remain unchanged. Seven purposes of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. A, to systematically propagate spiritual knowledge to society at large and to educate all peoples in the techniques of spiritual life in order to check the imbalance of values in life and to achieve real unity and peace in the world. B, to propagate a consciousness of Krishna as it is revealed in Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. C, to bring the members of the society together with each other and nearer to Krishna, the prime entity, thus to develop the idea within the members and humanity at large that each soul is part and parcel of the quality of Godhead, Krishna. D, to teach and encourage the Sankirtan movement, congregational chanting of the holy name of God, as revealed in the teachings of Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. E, to erect for the members and for society at large a holy place of transcendental pastimes dedicated to the personality of Krishna. F, to bring the members closer together for the purpose of teaching a simpler and more natural way of life. G, with a view towards achieving the aforementioned purposes, to publish and distribute periodicals, magazines, books, and other writings. I think we'll finish there. I've got to do a few things before we start busting the fireworks. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.